Today we start, guess what? We start with Plato. Plato's Apology of Socrates. This is the best introductory text to the study of political philosophy. Why? Let me give you two reasons. First, it shows Socrates, the reputed founder of our discipline, the founder of political science, and I will say a little bit more about that later on today, explaining himself and justifying himself, justifying his way of life before a jury of his peers. It shows Socrates speaking in a public forum, defending the utility of philosophy for political life. And secondly, the Apology demonstrates also the vulnerability of political philosophy in its relation to the city, in its relation to political power. The Apology puts on trial not merely a particular individual, Socrates, but puts on trial the very idea of philosophy. From its very beginnings, philosophy and the city, philosophy and political life have stood in a sort of tension with one another. Socrates is charged, as we will see, by the city for corrupting the youth in impiety toward the gods, right? In other words, he's accused of treason, a high capital offense. No other work of which I am aware helps us better think through the conflict, I would even say the necessary and inevitable conflict between the freedom of the mind and the requirements of political life. Are these two things, are these two goods, as it were, freedom of mind and political life, are they compatible, or are they necessarily at odds with one another? That seems to me to be, in some ways, the fundamental question that the Apology asks us to consider. Okay? Now, for generations, the Apology has stood out as a symbol for the violation of free expression. It sets the case for the individual committed to the examined life over and against a bigoted and prejudiced multitude. The clearest statement of this view of, again, the individual set against the mob in some ways is found in a work of a very famous civil libertarian of the 19th century, a man named John Stuart Mill. In his famous tract called simply On Liberty, Mill wrote, "Mankind can hardly be too often reminded that there was once a man named Socrates, between whom and the legal authorities of his time there took place a memorable collision." Over and again, and Mill is kind of a famous case of this, over and again Socrates has been described as a martyr for freedom of speech, and he has been somewhat extravagantly compared at various times to Jesus, to Galileo, to Sir Thomas More, and has been used as a role model for thinkers and political activists from Henry David Thoreau to Gandhi to Martin Luther King. So Socrates has become a very central, you might say, symbol of political resistance and resistance to political power, and of the dangers to the individual of sort of unchecked rule. But this reading of the Apology as, you might say, a kind of brief for freedom of expression and a warning against the dangers of censorship and persecution, although this has been enormously influential over the centuries, at least over the last century and a half, you have to ask yourself, is this the reading that Plato intended? Did Plato want us to read the dialogue this way? As a teacher of mine used to say, you read Plato your way, I'll read him his way. But But how did Plato intend this dialogue to be understood? Note that Socrates never defends himself by reference to the doctrine of unlimited free speech. He doesn't make that claim. He doesn't make the claim about the general utility of freedom or unlimited speech. Rather, he maintains, as he puts it near the end of the dialogue, or the end of the defense speech, that the examined life is alone worth living. Only those, in other words, engaged in the continual struggle to clarify their thinking, to remove sources of contradiction and incoherence, only those people can be said to live worthwhile lives. The unexamined life is not worth living, Socrates confidently, defiantly, you might say, asserts to his listeners, to his audience. Nothing else matters for him. His, in other words, seems to be a highly personal, in many ways highly individual quest for self-perfection, and not a doctrine about the value of freedom of speech in general. But even though, you might say, Socrates seems to be engaged in, again, this highly personal quest for self-perfection, there is something which one can't avoid deeply political about the apology and about his teaching. At the heart of the dialogue, or at the heart of this speech, rather, is a quarrel with his accusers over the question, never stated directly perhaps, but over the question of who has the right to educate future citizens and statesmen of the city of Athens. Socrates' defense speech, like every Platonic dialogue, is ultimately a dialogue about education. Who has the right to teach? Who has the right to educate? This is, in many ways, for Socrates, the fundamental political question of all times. It is the question of, really, who governs? Or maybe put another way, who should govern? Who ought to govern? Remember also that the city that brought Socrates to trial was not just any city. It was a peculiar kind of city. It was Athens. And Athens was, until only fairly recent times in human history, the most famous democracy that ever existed. I say fairly recent times until, the American democracy, but it was until at least the 18th or 19th century, the most famous democracy that ever existed. The speech of Socrates before the jury is perhaps the most famous attempt to put democracy itself on trial. It is not merely Socrates who is on trial. Socrates intends to put the democracy of Athens itself on trial. Not only does the apology to force Socrates to defend himself before the city of Athens, but Socrates puts the city of Athens on trial and makes it defend itself before the high court of philosophy. So the ensuing debate within the dialogue can be read as a struggle, again, over who has title to rule. Is it the people? Is it the court of Athens, the demos, to use the Greek word for the people? Or is it Socrates, the philosopher king, who should be vested with ultimate political authority? That is, of course, the question that's taken up in a very vivid way, much more explicit way, in the Republic. But it runs throughout the Apology. And you can't really understand the Apology unless you see that that is the question that Socrates is posing throughout. Yes? You with me? Yeah? Good. Okay. So, I had some names put on the board and some dates, just because I want to talk a little bit about the political context of this dialogue. One can, of course, read, there's nothing wrong with reading the Apology, again, as a kind of enduring symbol of the plight of the, you might say, the just individual confronted with an unjust mob or an unjust political rule. It is again a question that Plato takes up in the Apology, when in the Republic, excuse me, when a character in the book named Glaucon, who happens to be, as it were, the brother of Plato, asks Socrates if it is actually better to be just or simply to have the reputation for justice. And Socrates says it is better to be just, even if that results in persecution and death. But the trial is not, again, just an enduring symbol of justice versus injustice. It is an actual historical event that takes place in a particular moment of political time. And this bears, I think, decisively on how we come to understand the case both for and against Socrates. Let me talk a little bit about that context. The trial of Socrates takes place in the year 399, and all of these refer to, before the Common Era, 399. Some of you will know that trial follows very quickly upon the heels of the famous Peloponnesian War. This was the war related by Socrates' slightly older contemporary, a man named Thucydides, who wrote the history of the Peloponnesian War, the war that took place between the two great powers of the Greek world, between the Spartans and their allies, and Athens and its allies. The Athens that fought this war against Sparta was an Athens at the height of its political power and prestige, under the leadership of its first citizen, Pericles, whose name